There are no airtight arguments for the existence of God. I agree. And so does Paul. He's a host on a channel called Thinking Christian. Unfortunately, we're about to part ways. Welcome to Chasing Smoke.
And what I want to do in this video is talk about the claim there are no airtight arguments for God, or perhaps what is a fact. I think this claim is often used in a very misleading and manipulative way. It's meant to sometimes mean more than it's meant to imply, and that's why I want to explore this claim. So while I may agree that there are no airtight arguments for God, I don't think what this is often meant to imply necessarily follows.
The problem is not that the God claim is not airtight. The problem with the God claim is that it's unsupported by any evidence, and depending on how you define God, it may be impossible to support with evidence.
The claim is often used in an argument like this. Premise 1, there are no airtight arguments for the existence of God, or there is no airtight argument for the existence of God. You can, choose any one you want. I would agree with this premise. I would agree there's no airtight argument for the existence of God. We'll talk about other types of things that we may believe that there aren't airtight arguments for either. Premise 2, it is only reasonable to believe things that we have airtight arguments for. And the conclusion is, therefore, we should not believe in the existence of God. Now, this is an argument that I would totally disagree with. So the first problem with this argument is it ends up debunking atheism, because we could replace atheism or God with atheism. We can say, premise 1, there are no airtight arguments for atheism, which is, I'm defining atheism as the belief that God does not exist, not as atheism is the lack of belief in God. But regardless, right, there's no airtight arguments for atheism. There could be a case that God does exist. It's not completely clear that God does not exist either. And as a result, if it's only reasonable to believe things we have airtight arguments for, we should not believe in atheism. We should not believe God does not exist. The second problem with this argument is that premise 2 is actually pretty unreasonable to accept. We can replace God with just something else, like other minds, the external world, scientific results, the theory of evolution, these sorts of things. And we can basically say that, yeah, because we don't have airtight arguments for these particular things, we should not believe in them either because of premise 2. So, right, there's no airtight argument for belief in X. You can replace X with evolution. You can say, yeah, maybe young earth creationism is right. Maybe God created the world 6,000 years ago with the appearance of being 16 billion years old, and with the appearance that evolution is true, and maybe with some gaps in the fossil record. I don't know, but this is another possible explanation. And because this is another possible explanation, there's no airtight argument that evolution or naturalism is true, because here's an additional or alternative explanation for it. And if it's only reasonable to believe things that we have complete airtight arguments for, we should therefore not believe in whatever it is. And this gets to be really serious, because you can think, well, you don't know you're not in a dream or anything like that. I could be a figment of your imagination. You could be a brain in a vat. There are all these possible skeptical scenarios where you could be experiencing things that are not necessarily real. And therefore, if your standard of belief is only believing things you have airtight arguments for, there are lots of things you shouldn't believe.
When we recognize that a claim is not supported by evidence, we don't believe it. We reject it. When we recognize a claim cannot be supported by evidence, we should, in all possible cases, treat that claim as if it is false.
Somebody wants to claim, well, I have an airtight argument that the external world exists or that evolution is true, then the type 1 skeptic, if they're going to be consistent, should also be really skeptical of those claims and be like, wait a minute, there's no airtight argument that evolution is true or that the external world exists.
The only proposition one needs to accept without supporting evidence is the rejection of hard solipsism. We cannot know external reality is real. This is a problem for every imaginable worldview besides solipsism, so it is irrelevant for analyzing other worldviews.
So if somebody claims to be a skeptic and they have this really high evidential bar for belief in God, they need an airtight argument for the existence of God, but they believe other things like the external world existing, the theory of evolution being true, that other minds exist, these other sorts of things, they need to provide us a reason or a symmetry breaker why belief in God warrants such a high standard or burden of proof, or why this airtight argument is needed for God and not for anything else.
Why single out God is unreasonable? Depending on your definition of God, it may be unreasonable because it is definitionally illogical. In other cases, it's the type of extraordinary claim that should require extraordinary evidence.
And even notice how even the claim there are no square circles isn't necessarily metaphysically impossible. We can imagine some sort of magical realm where there are circles with 4 corners, or we redefine one of these things to be the case. We don't necessarily know that it's not possible. It's not possible logically, but to claim that logical impossibility somehow implies metaphysically impossible, well, that's another claim. And if you're a skeptic, perhaps that's a claim you should be skeptical of.
Logical possibility is all that matters. It's metaphysically possible that leprechauns exist and are controlling all of our fates behind the scenes in another dimension. Is there any point in modifying my behaviors to coincide with that possibility? Is there any point in even considering it?
The whole notion of reason or rationality is not really a concept that can be non-circularly justified. So any invocation of reason itself is not airtight by its own merits. And even worse, we don't really have an airtight definition of reason itself.
If you have a problem with non-circular justification of logic itself, then you might as well admit it's impossible to understand anything and stop pretending to explain shit on YouTube.
But what this does do is exposes some of the flaws in evidentialism, which is the idea that all beliefs need to be founded on reasons. But the main problem with evidentialism is you have this regress problem. You need reasons for those reasons, and reasons for the reasons that you need reasons, and so on and so on and so on. So it just kind of ends up becoming a bit of a mess.
The basis for evidentialism is that we evidently have sensory organs that give us useful information about an evidently independently existing universe which we evidently inhabit. Can we be sure any of this is true? No. Here we are back to solipsism.
So the problem here, I think, with airtight arguments is as follows. When we say airtight arguments, what really comes to mind is usually something like a syllogism, something like modus ponens, something like this. But how do we non-circularly justify that arguments or logic correspond to truth? This is no surprise to a lot of people, right? That logic can't prove itself. And you can imagine, Gödel's second incompleteness theorem, which shows any formal or axiomatic system cannot prove that the system itself is consistent.
Again, the fact that we cannot independently support the concept of logic using logic is not reason to reject logic, which has unfailingly served us in understanding literally everything we do understand.
So if your conceptual scheme is something like naturalism, some sort of scientific realism, or even atheism, perhaps the idea of God existing would seem like some sort of unnecessary hypothesis. And in a Bayesian way, conditioned on naturalism, why assume God exists? This would be some sort of unnecessary auxiliary hypothesis. The difficulty here is when we're having this conversation, we're asking a more fundamental question. How did we come to our conceptual scheme of naturalism or whatever, and is it justified? And one of the other questions we should ask is, does naturalism end up defeating itself if taken too far? Does naturalism end up undermining our reason for believing we have accurate cognitive faculties, including the ones that we have that led us to belief in naturalism itself? Kind of an interesting argument. Once again, made by a lot of different people, so don't want to take that too far. But these are kind of the questions that we're trying to explore here.
It really does seem at times that solipsism is the new theism.
And the other issue I want to say too is there are problems with just using coherence alone. So some people say, okay, the coherence within our conceptual scheme is fine because all we care about is the coherence of beliefs, not necessarily the objective truth or falsity of these beliefs. Or perhaps, and put another way, beliefs are justified based on their coherence or how will they fit into a conceptual scheme, not anything else. But as Plantinga argues, I think this was a good point. It's changed my view on this. Basically, if you're a coherentist, you're basically arguing circular reasoning is fine as long as the circles are larger.
Logic proves itself by demonstrating its usefulness for understanding the universe.
Reformed epistemology suggests belief in God can be rational, even if there are no arguments for the existence of God, whether some of those arguments are airtight or not.
This is stretching the concept of rational a very long way. I can't make any arguments for why leprechauns control our fates, but that doesn't mean the belief isn't rational? Really?
The fact that there are arguments for the existence of God, and some in more recent years more compelling and creative than have ever been, just is more helpful, even if that's not necessarily what is needed.
Again, arguments for the existence of leprechauns also exist. Most people know that the time to believe something exists is when there is evidence that it exists. We all apply this principle to claims about fairies and Santa Claus and ghosts and the Great Pumpkin, but some people make excuses when it comes to applying this principle to their own favorite magical being.